Hello, good morning everyone. Thank you for attending our webcast today. My name is Vincent Payne. I'm the Director of Technology and Services here at our ECS. Today we'll be focusing on the topic of DevOps. What it is, how to engage with our vendors successfully, and how do we maximise the opportunity. I'm joined today by Nigel Kirsten, CTO at Puppet. Welcome, Nigel.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, a few questions for you, Nigel. We were going to run through and give some of our partners some information into how and why they can engage a little better into the whole ecosystem of DevOps. So, could you give us a brief sort of background to Puppet and what has made it so successful?
Sure. So in about, I think it was probably 2005, 2006, Luke Knies, who was the original founder of Puppet and the author of most of the original Puppet code and CEO up until a few years ago, I think he was just generally pretty frustrated with the state of system administration. He was a sysadmin, generally working in the Solaris and Linux space, and was just really frustrated at how repetitive a lot of the work was and how a lot of it really wasn't very shareable. For those of us who were sysadmins around that time, automation generally took the form of shell scripts that you wrote, and they weren't modular, they weren't composable, so you'd find yourself solving the same problems over and over again. And there were several tools out there that had made an attempt to try and solve this problem, but like BCFG2 and CF Engine, and CF Engine in particular, I think laid a lot of the groundwork for Puppet. Luke was a consultant in the CF Engine space, who really wanted something that was much easier to use and much more accessible. So he came out with something that was a very simple text system for describing the state that infrastructure should be in. And one of the words, some of the terms that we use a lot in the Puppet space are declarative and idempotent. And they sound kind of intimidating, but they're actually quite simple in a way. Declarative means that using Puppet, you can define the state you want something to be in, rather than describing how to get there. So rather than going, look at the user's password, check what it is, and if it's different, then set it in a very sort of procedural way, you instead just describe, I want the user's password to be this. And you can do that with file resources, websites, disks, all sorts of different objects that you use as a sysadmin. And idempotent means that you can rerun it over and over again safely. Because one of the challenges with shell scripts is if you're performing 50 different actions and you got 20 actions in and something failed, you then have to go and make sure you weren't repeating the same action again because it might cause some side effect on the system that you didn't want. So that was sort of the basic idea of Puppet. So when I first adopted Puppet in 2007, when I first moved to Google, I hadn't used a tool like that before, but I had a pretty complex, huge environment that I had to manage, and with lots and lots of competing different requirements. And when I first came across Puppet, it was honestly life-changing as a sysadmin. I was just like, oh my God, I can now not only solve problems in a much easier, more repeatable, more efficient way, but I can take that work that I'm doing and I can share it with other people. So you can create a Puppet module that say manages your IIS server or registry entries or SE Linux policies. And then you can create that and share it with other people, and then they can make use of it. And so I think at that particular time, one of the reasons Puppet exploded in popularity so much was that virtualization wave had happened. And so if you look at the whole bottleneck of provisioning a system and configuring a workload on it, it used to take you weeks to provision the host, the physical machine, plug in the Ethernet cables, configure the IP addresses. And so if it took you a few days to set up an Apache web server on top of that, it wasn't that big a deal. But once we had virtualization and we could actually create machines really, really quickly on demand, suddenly that was the big bottleneck. And so I think we came out very much at the beginning of the whole DevOps movement, where infrastructure is code, which is what we use to describe tools like Puppet. We can describe infrastructure in the form of code and then start applying software engineering principles to it, very interlinked with the whole DevOps movement. Because in many ways, I think DevOps came out not just about frustrations between development and operations, but it was really about how do we take the things that we have now in development in terms of software engineering principles, reliability, predictability, peer review, all of those things, and apply them to the craft of system administration, which had been a much more manual space up until that point.
Wow, great. It's really good information there, thank you. So in terms of our sort of partner ecosystem and them getting started with Puppet, from a technical perspective, what would you recommend? How do they get started with the technology?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think because What we tend to see is that what I just described was traditional Puppet, and it always feels weird talking about things that aren't that old and using terms like traditional. But the other day I heard someone talk about their legacy Kubernetes deployment, which made me feel very, very old. So we have another tool called Bolt. And Bolt is a tool that lets you do more operational tasks. So what I described before was, Puppet about desired state configuration, about you want to maintain the state and remediate configuration drift on an ongoing basis. Sometimes you just have to do an operational task. And a good example there would be, I want to add a machine to a load balancer pool, or I want to remove it from the pool. It's not so much about maintaining state in a certain way over time. It's about just going and performing an action. And cognitively, it's a lot simpler to start adopting tools like that because there's less of a mental model shift. So you can use Puppet Bolt to take advantage of the Puppet language to perform those sorts of operational tasks. And as you move through the sort of automation maturity model that we tend to see, which is people start taking their shell scripts, using Puppet Bolt to execute them. So they're essentially putting an Iron Man suit on top of their existing automation. Then they start moving them into task plans, which allow you to have control flow around those things, which solves a lot of problems. And then once you've gotten to that point, you've actually created a whole bunch of Puppet code that you can start using to do desired state management. So we tend to see people adopting Puppet Bolt first. And if you go and just Google for Puppet Bolt getting started, we have a whole bunch of really, really great hands-on labs for teaching you how to download the tool, how to get started, and how to start making use of the huge library of configuration management code that people have written over the years for the Puppet and Bolt ecosystem.
Oh, great. Okay, so that's some really good recommendations there. And in terms of moving to more of a kind of commercial angle, how would you say our partners are best suited to sort of, or how do they really engage with organizations? Because I think we're very good traditionally to talking to security folk and data center guys, but moving, so that's that whole shifting left metaphor to sort of talking to the app development teams and these sort of people. Who do we speak to, and how do they engage?
Yeah, so I think there's different answers for different environments, but I think what I would tend to say would be look for the people who are looking to modernize either their IT practices or the things that are adjacent to IT. So for example, sometimes that is the IT department who's gone, we need to move away from a world of doing things manually. We're adopting public cloud. We've got on-premise. We're trying to come up with a common automation platform across all of those. But sometimes it's the security folks, because I think one of the things I've been really excited about with the whole DevSecOps movement has been seeing security teams work out how to collaborate more easily earlier in the pipeline. So one of the things I didn't mention about the advantage of an infrastructure as code approach is that it makes collaboration at the design phase significantly easier. So rather than a sysadmin having to do a bunch of work on a server and perhaps write a internal wiki page or an internal document on what they've done, and then someone else reads it and goes, well, I actually would like it to be like this, and dealing with that sort of slow feedback cycle. Once you have an infrastructure as code approach, someone can define the work they're doing in the form of code, and then other people can review it, make changes, and take all of those sort of advantages of building software and apply them to other spheres. So for security folks, even though Puppet for a long time, we didn't actually have a dedicated security tool, and we now have one called Puppet Remediate, we were always sort of a friend of the security people. Because if you think about the core benefits of an infrastructure as code approach of being able to go, this is the state something should be in, and we're going to make sure it stays in that state over a period of time, and we're going to put out reports on what actually changed and when I needed to either make an intentional change and it rolled out through all of the systems, or when I had to make a corrective change. Many of those attributes are the same things that security people care about. And so we've always been a friend of the security people. But with the DevSecOps movement, we're seeing more and more collaboration where security teams, rather than being a checklist at the end of production and going, okay, let me go validate this as a secure design, they actually can work and collaborate on the design phase. So the entry point's different for different people, and sometimes it's the development teams. The development teams are facing a lot of pressure, and they're just like, we need to be able to provision testing environments more quickly. We need to be able to make changes to production more quickly, and we just can't afford to do it in the old way of putting a ticket into a ticket system and then waiting for humans to do all of the work. There needs to be automation in some of those processes. So to summarize, I guess I would say that my advice would be look for the people who are looking to modernize practices the most, and work out how we can attach the benefits of configuration management and desired state management to those business goals, because we're actually an incredibly flexible tool that can serve all sorts of different purposes.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of some of the sort of successful projects you've been involved in, from a sort of partnering perspective, are there any vendors that you typically see a great deal in the security space? You know, is Splunk something you see, for example?
Absolutely. So I think, you know, Splunk have done an incredible job exposing a whole bunch of data from inside companies into dashboards and decision-making tools across the business. I think, you know, reducing Splunk to just being a log analysis or monitoring tool really sort of misses the point that a lot of this data was hidden and locked up inside organizations, and exposing it allows people to make better decisions. So we love doing deployments with Splunk, and a lot of our really big customers, particularly in the financial services space, we do Puppet Enterprise and Splunk joint deployments where infrastructure data and application data that Puppet collects as a matter of just doing its job every 30 minutes gets exposed to Splunk, and being able to combine that data with all sorts of other bits of information around the business really gives you a much more holistic view. I think what we tend to see there is that that's where you can sort of get out of the IT basement, so to speak. And my background is IT, so I don't want to sound like I'm being disparaging at all, but I think the unfortunate reality in a lot of big organizations is that IT will still get seen as a cost center rather than a strategic enabler. And so using a tool like Splunk, integrating with tools like ServiceNow, any of the ITSM tools, really allows you to demonstrate much more business value rather than just we're making the systems run better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, interesting. So, and in terms of some of the kind of larger security vendors, Palo Alto, Checkpoint, those guys, do you have a lot of sort of pre-written scripts and integration with those guys as well?
Yeah, they tend to be reasonably simple to get going. I think particularly on the Puppet Remediates side, we work with, you know, tools like Rapid7 and Tenable, where we manage to integrate with a lot of the scanners, because I think what we see a lot of the time out there is that a lot of companies have deployed scanners to show them their lists of vulnerabilities that they're currently experiencing, but the remediation in many ways is the difficult part. And we see over and over again that security teams deliver these big checklists and big spreadsheets of current vulnerabilities to operations teams who, unless they have an automation action engine that's like Puppet and like Bolt, they don't actually have the ability to, at scale, remediate those things really quickly. And remediation, I feel, is it's a classic, the technology is not really the problem, because there's an awful lot of people interaction. You've got to work out, you know, who's actually responsible for this service? Are they approving of this? Is it in a change window where I can make these things happen? And the more you can take the technical part of the remediation and reduce the cost of that to as close to zero as possible, the more you actually can get to focus on the rest of the organizational and people issues that are in the way of resolving those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you see some of these sort of projects that have been worked on are driving these sort of more advanced sort of SOCs?
I beg your pardon?
So in terms of some of our larger end users, in terms of sort of automating the control around security, so they're building SOCs, so for that sort of automated security response.
Yes, we're seeing that the more, there's sort of, I guess, a few different aspects to that. The more advanced folks that we see tend to build out highly automated responses, incident management responses. And I think this is the goal that we see a lot of enterprises going for. And they want to be able to say, you know, we've detected an intrusion, we've got some particular issue, a vulnerability has appeared, and we want to be able to automatically remediate that because we can't afford to have any window open when anyone can take advantage of it. And to actually solve that there's quite a lot of dependencies in the way. You need to have good automated provisioning of the stack that your applications are deployed on. You need to have the ability to deploy with tests in an automated fashion, which usually means you need to have a good, strong CI/CD platform for both your application code and your infrastructure code. You need to have enough trust between different areas of the organization. So, for example, that the security system can make a change to, say, the software-defined network layer so that you can firewall off a given area that's become vulnerable, that you can automatically file a ticket through the change management folks to let them know what's going on, that the operations team have an alert. There's all these different people that need to be involved there, and there tends to be automation required up and down the stack. So that's sort of the North Star, and I would say most people are not actually there yet. Where I see a lot of people do quite well at is they're creating automated security profile testing sort of early on in their CI/CD platform, where the infrastructure and application folks are working with the security teams to go, let's automate the tests and validation so that things can essentially be secure by default by the time they get to production. And if they're a little bit more advanced, they work out how to start exposing those tests directly into the IDEs of developers. So as they're building applications, they're getting real-time feedback of whether this is going to be a secure design or not. And these things are all much easier to say than do, so I don't really want to gloss over the difficult work that many people have to do, but the benefits are huge if you can get there, because there's so much wasted people time in all of these steps of validating security.
And I guess that brings us around to culture, really. How do you see the sort of the better organisations? How do they drive that sort of cultural thing around the automation and the engagement between, you know, the operations guys and security guys and the software development guys? Where would you, I mean, perhaps talk through a case study or something where you've seen that?
Yeah, so I think a really good example here is we did a really good webinar recently with RBS where they talked through their cultural approach to modernizing change management. And I think it's difficult to point to a silver bullet here, because, you know, many large organizations are dysfunctional, and many of them are dysfunctional in many different ways. But I think there has to be managerial support and impetus and momentum created for people who are trying to cross-functional boundaries, cross-organizational boundaries to get work done. I see that the organizations that are bad at this tend to be the ones where there's a huge resistance to, I'm in team A and I want to go talk to team B about doing some work. Like, either it's difficult to talk to them, your managers discourage it, all of those sorts of things. The thing we've seen over years of doing the State of DevOps report was that there's a pretty direct correlation between the number of organizational boundaries you can easily cross in order to get work done and how good the work is in the end, if that makes sense. So I think the collaboration is almost too easy a word to describe, because everyone talks about collaboration. I think the more you've lowered the friction for people in different roles to, on their own, go and find each other, know what the other team's doing, make suggestions to that work, that's the really powerful thing. I think a good example here is a lot of organizations still lock up their infrastructure code, their application code, and make it very constrained. So only the teams who are working on it can even read it, let alone modify it. And we see that the cultural change that occurs once you move to a world of trying to make things as visible as possible across the organization, just that alone, allowing people who want to innovate and who have an idea to go and look at code and go, oh, well, if we just changed it like this, then that would make this other person's job easier, or would make my job easier. And having teams be willing and open to hear that sort of feedback and make those changes, that's the powerful stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose for our partners then to engage successfully into sort of larger enterprises around sort of DevOps, it means that they do need to speak to you know, every area of the business, really, qualify, you know, what security guys are trying to achieve, what the operations guys are trying to achieve, and get in early, I think they say, don't they, to really try and influence.
Absolutely, and I think this is the opportunity that partners have, which is that often in big organizations, I've lost count of the number of times when I go into a large organization, there's a bunch of people from different areas of the business there because there's an initiative to try and solve something, and you talk to them and you realize it's the first time they've all been in a room together. And of course, I'm referring to the old normal where we actually used to go to rooms and talk to people. But I think this is the opportunity partners have, where you can be seen as being much more strategic than just shifting bits or selling hardware or any of the things that partners have traditionally done with large enterprises, where you can be that third party who comes in and says, I know how to put, these various bits and pieces together from the portfolio of solutions we have. We can solve problems for you in application team, for you in change management, for you in security, for you in the operations team, for the cloud teams as well. And I think being perceived in that way is only really good for your bottom line and allows you to be attached to much more strategic projects with much more long-lived, enduring value.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if we move on to another well-used term at the moment, DevSecOps, and then sort of integrating security in the right way, where do you see, for perhaps some of our traditional security partners, who and what should they be talking about in terms of some of the newer technology that's been integrated into some of these stacks?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, it's almost an overused phrase, shift left. But I think there's a little bit of nuance there that often I think people talk about shifting left and they think of moving all the way from security being at the end of the line in production, so to speak, and moving all the way to the beginning to the software design phase. I think you can do this in a progressive manner so that the security people can start, say, interacting with the operations teams so that they become part of the provisioning process for hardware. Working with the application teams to be part of the provisioning process for application stacks that live on top, even before you move into the development cycle itself. So I think it can be easy to be overwhelmed, I think, with a lot of the newest sort of DevSecOps tools that promise to show you all of the security visibility into the IDE phase, which means you're involved in complicated conversations with application teams about the stacks they use and the IDEs. But I think there's a value proposition you can bring there of the more you adopt an infrastructure as code tool and you get security people on board with using it and having visibility and collaborating on designs, I think that's one of the huge benefits of the whole DevSecOps movement. I guess the other thing I would add is if you're selling software, and this is I think a bit of a call to arms to most software vendors, having good APIs is just table stakes these days, because all of the things we're talking about need to be glued together in the form of APIs. I think this is where if you offer services, if you do integration consulting, these things are a lot easier than they used to be. It used to require serious software engineering chops to be able to glue together two different systems. APIs were more complex. We used XML RPC. Nowadays, we have, and I don't want to diminish the work that people do at all, but it's significantly easier, and it should be significantly easier to go into these big companies, discover problems, and offer them more of a complete package that is, we can put you in touch with consultants, or we can provide consultants, or the vendors themselves can help do integrations. Being able to integrate different tools together, I think, is the real value prop here, particularly in the security space.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite interesting in the whole services piece, because we look at sort of services being the overarching kind of almost the part. What is the solution? Well, you can invest in technology, but if you're not optimizing those investments by doing the right things with the investment around services, it seems to be even more important here. So maybe for our partners, in the security world specifically, is looking at training their security engineers into being able to understand how these APIs work.
Yes, absolutely, and I think this is the thing where it's the uplift from someone who doesn't code but works in IT these days, whether it be security or operations, to knowing just enough code to be able to glue things together is lower than it's ever been, and I think the opportunity is huge.
Yeah, and I think the same thing could be said for our data center vendor partners as well. The guys who are implementing, they may have implemented the networking and storage side of things, but how are they automating that infrastructure and also moving it into cloud as well, so everyone has a a hybrid cloud approach of some sort these days. So I guess what do you see around that in particular? Where have you seen some successes there? So if I was going to talk to, or we were going to influence some of our sort of more traditional data center partners, how do you think Puppet would sort of integrate with those guys?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, and I think one of the challenges a lot of the traditional hardware vendors has had is that they've we rarely see a common automation platform across all of a given function, like network, storage, in the same way that we've done with compute. So where Puppet came from originally was very focused on managing the operating system and the bits inside it, and we've since branched out into network and storage. I think what I tend to see in a lot of the big enterprises is the vendor-specific management tools get used in small silos, and they don't really end up providing that sort of business value of an overarching common platform that everyone can actually collaborate on. So where Puppet comes in, and where I think we do a really great job, is that we can tie into those existing management tools. We can work on integrations to manage specific, network and storage hardware vendor work, and the force multiplier of having a common platform there, particularly once you start expanding that across network, compute, and storage, can be really, really huge. So did that sort of get to your question? I'm extolling the benefits of a common platform rather than management tools in silos.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we probably see that more and more in all vendors as they approach cloud. Most of the large vendors are, apart from the hyperscalers, who they pretty much do what they want to do, but some of the other guys, they have to have that sort of cross-platform, cross hyperscaler almost integration points, don't they, to sort of as you say, automate all those different elements, really, because it's very difficult when you're clearly moving, I guess, from on-premise. You've got a number of applications that might be started to be refactored into the cloud somewhere, and then there's that big discussion on do I tie myself up into AWS's tools, or do I tie myself up into Azure's tools, or do we look at something else that has a more holistic kind of presence?
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the best things the cloud has done has been provide that sort of the expectation of self-service interfaces and APIs that you can actually glue together. That's again just table stakes now. And so we've seen all of the on-premise vendors have to start to adopt that. What I'm definitely seeing is that there's not always an appetite to re-architect all of the applications in a way that makes sense to move to the cloud. And this is sort of a difficult topic, because I definitely don't want to come across as a cloud naysayer, because the benefits are undeniable. But I think at the same time, you can apply a small amount of automation using modern tools and modern practices to your on-premise work, build self-service interfaces around those, and get an awful lot of the benefits of cloud. And I think particularly large enterprises that have been struggling with project-based funding, where, say, an application still exists and still works for the business, but there isn't a dedicated application team for it anymore, having that huge weight of legacy, and legacy almost has too many pejorative notes to it. This tends to be the functional software a business is running on. Rewriting all of that is just not really an option. You're not going to move all of that work to containers. And if you do just do heavy sort of lift and shifts to the cloud, the unit economics might not actually make sense, particularly given your existing data center commitments. And so the successful customers I'm seeing are the ones who are looking at cloud, going, well, what does that give us? And can we apply some work to our on-premise infrastructure and get some of those same benefits?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point. It's just mapping out those existing investments and where you sit. There's lots of things to think about there. So no, it's really interesting. So I think that's us for our half an hour. So Nigel, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for those insights. I hope this will help our partners sort of formulate some engagement plans into sort of new areas of their customers' businesses. Thank you, Nigel. Please look out for some further DevOps-based topics via our webcasts. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks, then. Bye-bye.